Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Bible class. Jake here along with Jacob, and we're going to continue to work through our study of Ecclesiastes. If you want to head there in your Bibles, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapters 4 through 6 tonight. Jacob?
Yeah, we're going to, one thing that we know about Ecclesiastes is Solomon can get a little repetitive, right? Mm-hmm. He's trying to drive home a point, so we understand that. But so we decided these next few times we'll probably group a few together, and we feel like we can still get the main 1, 2, and 3 as he's starting out. Obviously, that's new stuff, right? Because we haven't gone through it yet. The rest of us will start to get a little repetitive, but that's okay because there's still important stuff to pull out from it.
And with that in mind, if you've not been able to join us for a week, or if you've just slept since then and forgotten a little bit, just by way of a very high-level reminder, chapters 1 through 3 and the discussion there, of course, 1 starts out with him introducing the point that he continues throughout, which is that of vanity and how life is vanity. And he makes that point very clear as he's introduced as the preacher, as those who are penning, or those who are said these words, penned by someone else, what we're led to believe.
Have you counted how many times he says vanity in Ecclesiastes?
I haven't.
I have not either. So if you got that information, you can. That's a fun little trivia question.
Text Jacob or Jake how many times the word vanity appears in Ecclesiastes. That'd be good to know. But he introduces that theme in chapter 1. Chapter 2, he gets a little deeper into the theme, but he talks about it in 3 main buckets.
Right.
And those buckets being that he looked into pleasure and what pleasure was for him, and he found all the pleasures of life to be vain and empty. And then he looked at wisdom, and of course we know this of Solomon. Extremely wise, blessed to be that by God. Wise in the sense that he asked for that wisdom, that was his request.
Yeah.
Found wisdom to be vain. And then lastly, he looks at that of work and the work that we're given to do, and he found that also to be vain. And that's where he leaves off in chapter 2. In chapter 3, he gets into this discussion on time. And essentially, he kind of harkens back a little bit to chapter 1. In chapter 1, he talks about all the cycles of the world, right, of the earth as God has put it into motion, and basically points out that the earth continues on, the water cycle continues on as it always has, the sun and the moon continue in their cycles, and then you're here and then you're not, right? And he's highlighting that point of time. And in chapter 3, he gets deeper into the idea of time, basically saying that God has appointed a time for everything to happen, but that in the end, he has put eternity into our hearts, which is what separates us from the animals, that we, being the children of God, look for something more, something eternal that is beyond what we have here.
Right. Just recapping that, it is really important, and we're about to get into a lot of things in 4 through 6 that deal with similar ideas. 4 through 6 deal with a lot of similar ideas, but you're going to continue to see this recurring theme of Solomon saying, hey, I've seen this. Here's what you need to know, right? That's what it has consistently boiled down to is, hey, I know this because I've been given this wisdom, right? And here's what you need to know from someone who's experienced it.
So we're going to get into chapter 4 and verse 1 beginning. It says, Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun.
That's pretty heavy. Yeah, that's pretty heavy.
That's some heavy stuff. Now, there are a few things I want to note about this. We don't have a prize, unfortunately, but Jason Coggins wins the prize. Vanity is mentioned 33 times in Ecclesiastes.
In 12 chapters, that's
a lot.
It's quite a bit.
That's a lot. What is that? Almost 2 per?
Almost 3 per, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. Yeah. Bad math. Whew. Okay.
You didn't do well on your times table.
No, I did not. No, that was not my strong suit.
Yeah.
One thing to note about this oppression that Solomon's noting, the time in which Solomon reigned was maybe not even arguably the most peaceful, prosperous time for God's children.
Right.
I mean, I think most people would agree that was it.
That was the realization
of the promised land, as it was meant to be.
Yeah, I mean, you got the temple being rebuilt. You got prosperous, I think would be the best word to describe that time for the children of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a very prosperous time. Everything that they really needed at that time was given to them. So his look at oppression here is, it's kind of jarring. Like, okay, it's going to set you back a little bit how heavy he gets with it.
Yeah.
Sure.
I want to note there's some dissension. So apparently Holly White is arguing there are 37 mentions of vanity. So we may be getting into the nuances between versioning, right?
Yeah.
Translations.
Yeah, that could be.
So this is something that might take some effort to answer. One thing I want to note, back to the oppression point, and the state of God's children when Solomon is writing this. Again, he's saying that those that are oppressed, that he feels better for those who have never existed and those who are dead.
Yeah.
Because they haven't had to see, those who have never existed have not had to see the oppression of the earth. But I just want to note a few references. So if we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4, this section of Scripture is talking about the prosperity that Solomon enjoyed. But we look at verse 25, says, "And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon." So just a note that all of those underneath Solomon's rule dwelt in a land that was safe from enemies. Of course, Solomon's father David took care of all of them, right? I mean, he ran maybe not everybody out. We see later that becomes a problem for Solomon. And then I want to note too, so that's to the peace point, but to the prosperity and the wealth that they enjoyed. Not only were they in a land of peace, but 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 21, "All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon." Now it goes on to say in verse 27, "The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowlands." This is a kingdom where they don't even regard silver as anything valuable because there's so much of it.
Right.
This is the wealth and the prosperity that God gave to his children on behalf of Solomon and Solomon's faith, right? Solomon started out as a very faithful king. He pursued God. He pleased God with what he asked for. Now, we know that later, as it's recorded for us in 1 Kings, it's the women of those in the land that weren't run out that get him they turn his heart toward other gods. And that's what causes Solomon to lose favor with God. But he's writing about oppression here. I say all this to say he's writing about oppression here in Ecclesiastes, and he's writing from a perspective of there's no oppression on their part.
Right, and I'll say this, whenever I think about that and Solomon's take here of talking of oppression in a time where they're prosperous, it takes me back to that old story of anytime you talk about something being bad in your life, someone who lived before you says, "You have no idea how good you have it now." Like, do you realize, someone who lived through, the Great Depression and stuff, they're like, you have no idea what it's like to really want and struggle. And to a point, that's true, but I think speaking to Solomon here, each generation will have their own oppressions. It may not be the same oppression, but that doesn't make it less oppressive. It doesn't make it less. And what he's saying here is on earth, when he's getting you to take the mindset to view heaven as your goal and God as everything, the earth, by definition, is oppressive because a lot of the things are against that, right? It's the opposite of where oppression gets its name from.
And not to say I'm painting a picture of there was no oppression at the time, right?
No.
Solomon, at the same time, it's recorded for us in 1 Kings that there was forced labor on behalf of Israel that was performed by those in the land who had been taken captive.
Yes.
So he, in that sense, was the oppressor, right?
Right.
So I guess the point being, even in the midst of this blessed utopia in which they found themselves, Solomon is still able to come to the conclusion that considering the oppression that gets put on people here on the earth, he says those who are already dead are better for it.
Yeah.
And those who have never been are better for it because they don't have to experience the sorrow that we as men put upon one another through oppression and mistreatment.
And he's not saying they didn't have oppressions at their time, because I've heard someone mention that too, of, well, you're taking away from what they actually have. He's not doing that. He's just saying they're not having to deal with it anymore, right? And that's why they're blessed, is because they're not having to deal with it anymore, that they didn't deal with it, but that's been taken.
Right. So let's look at verse 4 where we left off. It says, "Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full, together with toil and grasping for the wind. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and grave misfortune." Solomon gets into this discussion, and this discussion on pursuing earthly things, right? Pursuing things that we think will fill us up. And he's going to talk more about it in chapters 5 and 6. So tonight we're going to spend less time here on it in chapter 4. But he continues with this idea that verse 4 of chapter 4, that so much toil that we do, so much work, and so many goals that we set is because we envy our neighbor.
Right, yeah.
Because we see this material world as something to be achieved and something that says something about our status.
Right.
And so we've got to go out and get it. Now, some might argue and say, well, it's easy for Solomon to say that because he built a kingdom where silver was regarded as stones.
Right.
I actually had an individual tell me one time, he said, wouldn't you say that only the people who have money can say that money is overrated? and I argued with him a bit. I said, well, no, I wouldn't say that actually, because there are people who don't have a lot of earthly possessions but have gotten to themselves to a place where they understand that those things aren't really important.
Right.
That as long as God gives them what they need to live, that the rest of it is, as Solomon says, just vanity.
You know, speaking to Paul, kind of speaking on that same thing, worldly wisdom would tell you that, right? But that's not the kind of wisdom that we're. I think I just died down.
I think Jacob's mic we just lost Jacob's mic.
I got to get battery up.
We would share microphones, but that would be a little less social distance, right? So we measured, if you're wondering at home, this is not 6 feet. But in talking about this idea that Solomon, in all of his splendor and all of his glory, he says, look, people out there, they envy their neighbor. They go and they seek after all of this gain. And what do they gain it for? And he even highlights an example, which he'll do several times in the next few chapters. He highlights an example. He says, there's an individual who's by himself, has no companion, no one to have an inheritance, and yet he spends his whole life toiling, and for what? And he says that also is vanity. Verse 9 of chapter 4, he says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So Solomon, it's a little bit of a transition, but he's highlighting this idea of the support that we give one another, how people are blessed by having companionship, by having help. Jacob, I'm reminded of a story when I read this.
Yeah?
You read verse 11, again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. So this illustration may be somewhat lost on us in our days of HVAC and attic fans and air conditioners in cars, but there was a time when that would have really rang true for a lot of people.
Right.
Well, I did at one time find myself on a trail in January, February. It was cold.
Right.
And I was stringing up hammocks with Clay Williams. Many of you know Clay. And Clay looked at me and he said, boy, it's a shame your hammock is not made for 2 people. And I said, well, actually it is. So what did? We put our sleeping bags in there and we slept in the same hammock to provide warmth, and it helped, right?
Yeah,
even in our
definitely.
sleeping bags,
right.
It gave us warmth as opposed to have been sleeping apart. And I remember that night thinking about this reference.
Yeah.
Saying, hey, look, here it is. I'm with my friend, we're in the same hammock, but we're staying warm. And I may have just embarrassed Clay telling that story. I don't know. Maybe not.
He'll be fine. I probably can think of a few better stories if we're trying to embarrass him.
We'll do that later. That'll come next week.
Yeah, there we go.
But Solomon is highlighting the importance of friendship and help just after coming out of the vanity of continuing to toil and work for something that's meaningless, right? So oftentimes society would tell us that more valuable to us than our friends is our possessions, is our status, the size of our bank account.
Right.
And Solomon, putting these two ideas together, it appears would argue vehemently against that.
And has there ever been a time in your life where you have noticed that more than now, where we have so much distance between each other, right? That you start to feel almost weaker and along those lines of being colder and the idea that whenever you have more, it just brings strength, right? When there's more with commonality, it brings strength for sure.
Verse 13, better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end to all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a grasping for the wind. This idea of vanity that Solomon keeps attaching to status and understanding that you may have it while you're alive and things people may look up to you and think a lot of you, but when you're gone, what was the end result, right? It's going to be left to somebody else, as he pointed out in previous verses. And in this case, he says, look, there's no end to who this king ruled over.
Right.
And yet once he's gone, somebody else is going to come and take his place.
Yeah.
And there'll be no remembrance of him.
Right.
And so again, he already in verse 4 has hit on the idea of riches and popularity, and how those things, while we attach so much weight to them, really in the grand scheme are meaningless compared to what we're to be to God.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to get into chapter 5. He starts out talking about keeping vows, and then he'll quickly transition into the idea of what wealth means, and he'll spend the second half of 5 and all of 6 pretty much on wealth. So 5 and verse 1 says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God.
You know, there's so much in those few verses that speaks to, I think, the whole idea of Christianity at this point. I mean, if you take this little section out and put it to Jesus' first words to us of him describing Christianity and what it's going to be, I mean, it's almost like he pulled all of this and dropped it in. Like you could almost do that, because there's so much of the understanding of Christianity in these words of Solomon right here, and understanding vows and what they mean.
Yeah, highlighting vows, highlighting vain worship.
Yeah.
Highlighting using your speech to be seen by other people rather than just speech that is peppered with grace and love. To Jacob's point, we'll go there to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. He's talking about here in Ecclesiastes those last few verses that we just read, verses 4 through 7. He's saying, if you make a vow to God, make sure you pay it. He says it's better that you don't make the vow than that you make the vow and don't pay it. Well, Jesus takes that a step further, as he does with most things in the Sermon on the Mount. He says in chapter 5 and verse 33 of Matthew, he says, again, you've heard it said by those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. So there's that idea that you shouldn't swear an oath or make a vow and then not fulfill it, swearing falsely, but that you should uphold your oaths. He says in verse 34, but I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or one hair black. But let your yes be yes and your no be no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one.
You know, when you think about what Jesus says there, and you go back to verse 4, when you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. This idea of not making statements you're not willing to back up, and going to Jesus there, and Jesus telling these people, look, I don't want to fool you into what this is. That's one thing Jesus, I feel like, never did, was he never gave us a false idea of what Christianity is going to be. He was almost maybe too realistic, or too real with us on some of those things. But in our minds, we go back to what Solomon's warning against, what Jesus is warning against, that intentions are good, right? Good intentions are a good thing to have. And you know the famous saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And he's speaking to that you know, we make these intentional ideas to do things, and I think Christianity is the number one thing that is hit by this. It's this idea of someone saying, yes, I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to represent Jesus, I'm going to follow him. And then they get into it and they say, okay, well, I'm going to bear the name Christian, but these things that I've been called to do seems like a little too much right now. I will get to those things. I'm going to build up to that, but it's a little too much right now. And Jesus, you know, from the beginning says, look, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be difficult. The things that you're going to be called to do are not easy. People aren't going to like you. Things are not going to always go your way. There are going to be times where you question everything, even God himself, because of things that happen in your life as a Christian. But take heart, because your reward is great, right? To those people who are poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? All these things tell us that things are not easy, they're going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. We like the worth it part. But we also say, well, if my reward is delayed, then the work is going to be delayed too. That's what kind of our mindset has become. I pay for what I get. So unless I'm getting something right now, I'm not going to put in payment right now. And that's not how things, you know, this credit card based lifestyle that we do, where once I get the product, then I'll, start paying back on it. Jesus says, no, Christianity was not something born on the fact of you get this and then you start. It's you live your life, the reward is at the end. I'm going to tell you exactly what's at the end. It's going to be the greatest thing you ever do, but you must do this in order to see it.
Which fits right into Solomon's argument in Ecclesiastes. The argument being that there are all of these things that are somewhat instant, right? This idea of instant gratification. All these things that we work and we strive for, and we say, when I have this, I'll be happy. And he's really about to get to that point hard in the next few verses. And yet in reality, he realizes, having had all the gifts that he could have wanted and all the blessings, he realizes that no, in fact, that's not what's going to do anything for us that's meaningful. What's meaningful is continuing to run the race with endurance, Hebrews chapter 12, and to not focus so much on the things of the earth that bring us immediate pleasure, but to focus on that ultimate reward that's waiting for us.
Can I summarize it with the words of Paul real quick? I feel like
Yeah.
Paul summarizes this so well.
Yeah.
So in Romans 12, these are two of the most famous verses, right, for Christians today, I feel like. But Romans 12:1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." So what's interesting there, Paul says, he doesn't say, we see this idea of prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. We're like, okay, I want that. I want to know what the will of God is. Paul doesn't tell us what the will of God is here, right? He says, once you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, as your spiritual service worth it. When you don't conform to the world, when you are transformed by the renewing of your mind, then the will of God will be proven to you. It's not a thing where Jesus says, okay, here's everything, you can have everything. We get that through the work, right? And I think that's what he's saying is, going back to Solomon, we are going to get these things through the work. We can't just expect it to be on our plate from the beginning. So if you're going to vow to be a follower of Jesus, you're going to vow to know what the will of God is. You've got to make your payment to get it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you think about the payment of Jesus' earliest followers, right?
Yeah.
They left everything.
Right.
And they noted as such to Jesus. They say, hey, look, Jesus, we left our families.
Yeah.
What can we expect to inherit? And Jesus said, well, you're going to inherit a throne of life, right?
Yeah, right.
So Ecclesiastes, back to chapter 5, verse 8, pick up where we left off. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent persecution of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. I think it's interesting to note, he jumps back to this idea of oppression. And he's talking about the hierarchy of government, and the hierarchy of these kingdoms under which they found themselves. These kings, and Solomon was the same, they would appoint those governors and regional leaders that would report up to them, right?
Yeah.
And so Solomon's pointing out, he's saying, look, when you see that there's oppression and you see that there's not justice, he's pointed out in previous chapters that there's not justice like we would hope to see justice, like we'd hope to see the justice of God. Justice doesn't work instantaneous like that because we're fallible men.
Right.
He says, when you see these things, just know that there are officials over the officials who are performing this oppression. And that essentially men are not to say that we're not fit to lead, but men are corrupt, right? And we can count on, just as he pointed out in chapter 4, we can count on oppression in our lives and the lives of other people. And that's what feeds back into that idea that he counted as the most fortunate those who had never been, because they didn't have to live and see that.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's look at verse 10. And I think it's funny. Well, we'll just read it first. It says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. I think it's funny he points out silver here.
Yeah.
Because it was just recorded for us in 1 Kings that we referenced that silver was like stones in the kingdom and it was counted as being worthless, essentially.
Yeah.
But he understands, and we can understand the symbolism here.
And I think it speaks to the time. I mean, I think that may be what Solomon's speaking to is they had become so consumed with, and who Solomon's writing this to, the people, they had become so consumed that silver didn't, we're told silver didn't mean anything to them because they loved it so much. Silver didn't even matter. Like it becoming so common to them. They were so consumed with having more than even silver that silver kind of lost its what it was.
It lost its luster?
Yeah. Blockbuster? I don't know.
We lost it.
Okay, sorry.
We were going good for a minute. We lost it. Verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who labored for the wind? All the days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. I've alluded to now several times that he's going to get into this idea of materialism, the pursuit of riches. And the very first thing he says in verse 10, or the first thing he says in this section, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, and he who loves abundance with increase, nor he who loves abundance with increase. Solomon's pointing out a truth that, unfortunately, for most of us, myself included in this, we have to see this lesson in our own lives before we can believe it.
No doubt, yeah.
Because so much of our lives, and I'm speaking from my experience, so much of my experience has been, well, if I just get to this thing, if I can just have this. If I mentioned that last week, actually, in reference to like life events, right? If I can just graduate, if I can just get married. Mm-hmm. So much of our lives are consumed with the attaining of the material.
Yeah.
Until you get that material and you realize, well, I'm not any happier for this.
Right.
In fact, in a lot of cases, as Solomon points out to us, a lot of times the acquisition of those material goods just heaps upon us more distress and more trouble and more sorrow.
Well, and if you ask any person that is very wealthy and continues to be wealthy, they say, why don't you just retire and enjoy what you've done? And a lot of these titans of industry will say, that I can't. I got to have more. Like what's driving me, the enjoyment is almost the drive to get more instead of enjoying your riches that you've obtained. It becomes more about having more, which is vanity. Solomon would say, and I would say too, that whenever you're so focused on getting things for yourself, that's the definition of vanity. Mm-hmm. So as you continue to do that, it's going to be continuing the need for more is usually on those who have a lot. Mm-hmm. Going back to the idea of, well, people with money are the only ones who can say, money's overrated.
Right.
Having money's overrated.
I think I mentioned this in a previous lesson, but I listened to an interview with Mark Cuban. If you're not familiar, Mark Cuban, billionaire, owner of the Dallas Mavericks basketball team. But he makes the comment in the interview. Now, this is not an endorsement of Mark Cuban. He says a lot, so I'm not jumping on the bandwagon with everything Mark Cuban says. But he made a comment. He said, people have this impression that folks like me who are rich, it all falls in place and everything's great.
Yeah.
He said, I may not understand what my electrical bill is month to month. That's obviously kind of below me with the amount of money I have. He said, but I still worry about my kids.
Yeah.
I still worry about my family. There's still all these things in life. So often we look up, right?
Right.
Socioeconomic scales. We look up and say, oh man, if I just had this.
Right.
Well, so often those same people we're looking at are either thinking, man, if I just had this, mm-hmm. or they're worried about something else. Or as Solomon points out, the more they get, the more ends up being consumed from them. Right? People start knocking on their door and asking for help, and they have family members coming out of the woodwork. Not so much asking for help. That sounds like we shouldn't be helping people, but trying to take advantage of the situation. Right? You know somebody who has money, and so you go and start trying to pursue that individual.
Yeah.
Verse 18, here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive the heritage and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. Solomon will make this statement and this reference several times through the remainder of Ecclesiastes. And that is that for those who God has blessed with the ability, it is our joy to enjoy the fruit of our labor, to not put our faith in it, to not put our hope in it.
Right.
As Jesus will point out, to bless others by it, right? Because it's not to serve us, it's to serve God's kingdom. And that is the joy that God has given us to pursue.
And one of the big things right now, and Jake hasn't watched it yet, but Hamilton, right? Hamilton's all over the place. Well,
don't spoil it for me.
This is not a spoiler because I think you know this character a little bit about him.
Do we become a country?
We do.
Okay.
Wait, that might have ruined it. But we have George Washington, as he, set up his life, and they pull from some of his writings to get to this place. But as he decided to, after 8 years, leave the presidency, one of the things that he says in his writings is he wants to rejoice in the labor of his fellow countrymen, that they had created this thing, but he had spent his whole time of fighting in the revolution and then creating this government and then governing over this people. He hadn't had time to sit and enjoy what they had done. And so one of the things he says is, I'm going to go and enjoy this before I die. because he knew his life was probably getting close to the end. He says, I'm going to enjoy this country that we worked so hard for. For 40 years, I've worked so hard on this. And he could have probably stayed president as long as he wanted to, but he said, he was setting a precedent, but he's also saying it's important for me to go enjoy in the fruits of all of our labor in this. So that idea of understanding that everything's not put into what you have, but you ought to be able to enjoy it because God is allowing you to enjoy it.
Right. And use it as a tool, right?
Yes.
That's what we pointed out. Chapter 6 and verse 1. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, sounds like Solomon, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it's an evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that his days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he. For if he comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and his name is covered with darkness, though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to the same place? For all the labor of a man is for his mouth, and yet his soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? And what does the poor man have, who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Whatever is one, he has been named already. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Now, I moved pretty quickly through that, and it was basically because we're getting a little long on time here. But I want to note the example. I mentioned earlier that Solomon will start to use examples, kind of hypotheticals. And he gives this hypothetical of a man who has 100 children. I would contend that's probably too many.
Yes, agree.
Just me. I don't feel like I could get a handle on that.
Agree.
But this man has 100 children, and he says he lives 1,000 years twice, right? So this is a man who's been blessed, and he says that if this individual was blessed with all that he could have ever wanted. And yet, what is it that Solomon points out that he's lacking? He says he can't enjoy goodness, right? He can't identify it. He can't appreciate it. He continues to pursue all of these things of life, and he can't appreciate the goodness that is there in God.
Right.
He uses a pretty stark and difficult example for us. He says a stillborn child is better than this individual who hasn't had to see all of this sorrow and oppression and all that comes with this life, not knowing goodness. And while that's an extreme example, certainly, I think it's important to note that it's coming from a man who almost fits that description. Solomon didn't live 2,000 years, but he was a man blessed beyond measure. We've pointed this out several times already. And so for him to say that if you can't appreciate goodness and the goodness that your life is blessed with, then you're never going to find rest, you're never going to find happiness, and the day of your death is going to be a dark day because you will not have fulfilled what God gave you to enjoy in this life.
Yeah, and that's what he's continued to say is, instead of looking at the things that you want, look at the things that God put in front of you and has given you to enjoy. And whenever you overlook that idea of the blessings of God and start looking at them as successes of your own, right? That's whenever they're not satisfying. Only whenever you realize that they're the gift from God can you really enjoy it. Because if it's a success of your own, it's never going to be enough, right?
So that's it for chapters 4 through 6. We're going to, we've been signing off for the last, few months, back since April, saying, we don't know what next week holds, but we'll figure it out and we'll see what happens. Well, finally, we're starting to see a little bit of light. Right, Jacob?
We are.
For those of you who heard the announcements this morning or have read the plan coming forward. Jacob, I'll let you talk first about next Sunday night before we get too far ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, so we mentioned a little bit in the kids stream and this morning. Next Sunday night is going to be our senior banquet. Typically, we do senior banquet in April, right? It's way past April, and the kids are seniors about to move off to college. But it's something so special we do here, and it means a lot not only to the seniors and their parents. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to Daniel and the elders and the members here. So we knew we had to do something. So we're actually going to try to do kind of a new style of senior banquet, a quarantine, COVID style of senior banquet next week. The seniors will be setting their tables up this week, so they'll be out next week if you'd like to drop them a card, a gift, whatever it is. And then at 5 o'clock, when we typically do this, we'll have a Devo. The families of the seniors will be here at the building, and we're going to do a senior Devo, but the Devo will be for everyone. It'll be on the live stream just like we do this. It just won't be our normal live stream. And then it'll go into senior banquet after that if you would like to partake and join them in celebrating our seniors through watching the video and listening to some speeches and things. But that's going to be next Sunday night. So both the Kids Connection and this class will not happen on the live stream at 5 o'clock, 4:30 and 5 o'clock next week.
Right. But will happen.
Yes.
We want to note that.
Yes.
Jacob and I are going to continue this study.
Yes.
But it will air at a different time.
Yeah, most likely they will be posted on Sunday mornings, almost like a Sunday morning Bible class. Mm-hmm. Now that we're moving towards, and we'll get to what's coming up on Sunday nights, now that we're moving towards a little bit of a normal Sunday night, we're going to shift and make the Kids Connection and this class more of a Sunday morning Bible class than a Sunday evening Bible class. Mm-hmm. So they'll probably be recorded and be uploaded to where you can watch between 8 and 9 on Sunday morning.
Right. So we'll put more information out to confirm that. But if you're getting ready for Bible class, if you're going to the 10 o'clock or to worship service, if you're going to the 10 o'clock worship service, maybe you can catch us before. If you're going to the 8 o'clock worship service, you can catch this as your class after. Same thing with Kids Connection.
Right.
And again, this is the 9th. The 16th is when we're going to start back with a Sunday evening service here at the building. Once again, even then, we will continue to have this Bible class, and it will just fill that Sunday morning slot. And then on the 19th, which is a Wednesday night, we will be kicking off growth groups in digital format, so via Zoom meetings at first. If you're watching this and you're not a member of a growth group, maybe you've never signed up or you know now that you'd like to, we're going to have an opportunity for those who are not in groups to get into a group. And that way we can make sure that everyone who wants to be can participate and can be connected in that way. Yeah,
and like Jake said, we've been saying for so long, we'll do this until we know what happens. We finally have an idea, and it is a plan. As Steve said this morning, something could happen that could change all of this. We put it in paper so people know kind of what the plan is, and we want to get back to a little bit of normal. But we also want to continue to be safe and stop the spread of this virus. So you guys know the plan now, and hopefully all of that goes through. But it is going to shake up a little bit and be a little different going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you once again for joining us. Again, if you have a need, please let us know. Let the elders know. Maybe it's something that we can help you with. Just please make it known to us. We love you all. We thank you so much for joining us each week. We look forward to doing these Bible studies, and hopefully you look forward to participating as well.
Definitely. Love you guys.
Love you. Have a good night.